I used to handle the salary question the same way a lot of people do. Whenever a recruiter asked, "What are your salary expectations?" I would immediately give them a number because I thought that was the professional thing to do. I assumed that if I avoided answering, I'd come across as difficult, inexperienced, or someone trying to play games. At the time, it felt like the safest approach. I wanted to seem cooperative and easy to work with, so I'd quickly throw out whatever salary I thought sounded reasonable based on the job title, the location, and a few online salary websites. Looking back, I realized I was making a huge mistake. Without realizing it, I was negotiating against myself before the company had even made an offer. For example, if I said I was looking for around $70,000 and the company had already budgeted anywhere from $70,000 to $90,000 for the position, the conversation almost always stayed close to my number. There was no reason for them to offer me 85K or 90Ks when I had already told them I'd happily accept 70K. I had basically done their negotiating for them. The opposite wasn't much better either. Sometimes I'd worry about underselling myself, so I'd throw out a much higher number hoping to leave room for negotiation. But if I guessed too high, I'd notice the recruiter's tone immediately change. Suddenly, the conversation became awkward before we had even discussed the responsibilities, the team, the benefits, the workload, or whether I even wanted the job. A few recruiters politely told me the position was outside my expectations. Others would simply say something like, "That may be difficult with our budget." At that point, I'd already anchored the conversation around a random number I had pulled out of thin air. The strange part was that I was making salary decisions without actually having enough information. I didn't know how demanding the role would be. I didn't know if the benefits were excellent or terrible. I didn't know whether it required overtime, travel, on-call rotations, or weekend work. I didn't know how much vacation time they offered. I didn't know if there was a bonus structure, stock options, tuition reimbursement, or promotion opportunities. Yet somehow I was expected to give an exact salary expectation in the first few minutes of the first conversation. After several interviews that all seemed to follow the same pattern, I decided I was going to stop giving the first number. Instead of answering with my expectations immediately, I started asking a different question. I simply said, "What compensation range has already been approved for this position?" That one small change completely changed the direction of the conversation. The interesting part wasn't just asking for the salary range. It was using the word approved. Before that, I had tried asking things like, "What's the salary range?" Or, "What's the budget for this role?" The answers were usually frustratingly vague. Recruiters would often respond with things like, "It's competitive. It depends on experience. We're open to the right candidate. Compensation is based on qualifications." Those answers didn't actually tell me anything. But when I asked what range had already been approved, the conversation often became much more specific. I think the wording made a difference because it acknowledged something everyone knows but nobody talks about. Companies usually don't start recruiting without having some kind of internal budget. Someone has already signed off on a compensation range. Someone has already decided approximately what they're willing to pay. By asking about the approved range instead of my own expectations, it sounded less like I was trying to negotiate and more like I simply wanted to understand whether it made sense for both of us to continue. To my surprise, most recruiters answered the question. Some would say something like, "The approved range is between $80,000 and $95,000 depending on experience." Others would give a wider range. Sometimes they'd even explain where they thought my experience would likely place me within that range. Of course, not everyone answered. Every now and then a recruiter would politely say they needed to know my expectations first. Instead of giving in immediately, I started responding with something like, "I'm flexible depending on the complete scope of the role, the responsibilities, the benefits, and the overall compensation package. I'd just like to confirm we're working within the same approved range before either of us invests too much time." That response turned out to be incredibly effective. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't demanding. It didn't sound like I was refusing to answer. It simply made it clear that I didn't want either side wasting hours interviewing for a position that wasn't financially realistic. One experience really proved how useful that approach could be. A recruiter initially reached out about what sounded like a great opportunity. The company seemed interesting. The job description looked solid. The responsibilities matched my background almost perfectly. Everything sounded promising. Instead of jumping straight into interviews, I asked about the approved compensation range. The recruiter paused for a moment before admitting that the position was actually capped at about $18,000, less than I was currently earning. That was the maximum budget. There wasn't any flexibility. Neither of us had done anything wrong. We simply weren't a financial match. The call ended after about 5 minutes. Had I not asked, we probably would have spent several weeks scheduling interviews, preparing presentations, meeting hiring managers, and negotiating, only to discover at the very end that the salary wasn't even close. That 5-minute conversation probably saved everyone involved several hours. The biggest surprise, though, came during the hiring process for my current job. Before talking to the recruiter, I had already done my research. Based on similar positions, my previous salary and market averages, I had convinced myself that asking for around $82,000 would be reasonable. In my mind, that already felt like a solid increase. If the recruiter had asked for my expectations first, I almost certainly would have confidently said, "I'm looking for something around $82K. Instead, I asked my usual question. What compensation range has already been approved for this position? The recruiter answered almost immediately. The approved range was $85,000 to $105,000. That instantly changed my perspective. Instead of negotiating around my own assumptions, I now understood the company's actual budget. Rather than anchoring myself at $82K, I responded by saying something along the lines of, "Based on the responsibilities you've described and my experience, I'd be targeting the upper half of that approved range." Notice that I still didn't lock myself into one exact number. I simply positioned myself where I believed I belonged within the range they had already established. After several interviews, technical discussions, and meetings with the hiring team, they eventually extended an offer. The final package came in at $99,000 plus a signing bonus. Could I have negotiated for even more? Maybe. It's impossible to know. But one thing I do know is that I never would have had the confidence to ask for $99K if I had been forced to guess before, learning their budget. I probably would have settled for something in the low, $80,000, simply because that's what I thought sounded reasonable. That's the biggest lesson I learned from all of this. The first number mentioned in a negotiation often becomes the anchor. If that number comes from you and it's lower than what the company was already willing to pay, you've accidentally limited your own earning potential. Since changing my approach, I don't see salary conversations as a guessing game anymore. I'm not trying to trick recruiters. I'm not trying to hide my expectations. I'm simply trying to understand whether the opportunity makes sense for both sides before either of us invests significant time. Sometimes recruiters still won't share the range. That's completely their choice. Sometimes company policy doesn't allow it. Sometimes they genuinely need my expectations first. And that's okay. This isn't some magical script that guarantees a higher salary every time. It doesn't force companies to reveal confidential information. It doesn't automatically increase job offers. But it has consistently helped me avoid undervaluing myself, avoid wasting time on roles that were never going to work financially, and negotiate from a position based on actual information instead of random guesses. Now, whenever I'm asked about salary expectations, I almost never give a specific number until I understand what the company had already planned to pay before they even knew my name. That one small habit has made every salary conversation feel more informed, more balanced, and far less stressful, and in at least one case, it quite literally helped me earn tens of thousands of dollars, more than I probably would have asked for on my own.